Today is Wednesday, June 7th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. At this point in my life, I'm 48 years old. I've been married for 25 years. I have 10 children, ages 23 down to 8. This fall, I'll have 4 adult children in college at the same time. And we'll have 6 kids still studying at home in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. My oldest son, Jonathan, is 23. He's in his heading into his last semester of his undergraduate studies. He's an ROTC cadet who will be commissioned as an officer in the military, in the U.S. Army, as soon as he graduates. And he'll have a full-time officer's salary as soon as he finishes his studies. My eldest daughter, Elizabeth, is in the same exact place Jonathan is. She's just a year behind him. So she's got a year to go before she has a full-time officer career position available to her. Both of them are away at camp this summer. The Cadet Command Advanced Camp, which is their final preparation for their officer's career. My third child, David, is a sophomore in college, going to be a sophomore in college, and he's going to be entering into the same ROTC program that my older 2 kids have been in. He'll actually be on campus with both of them, starting. All 3 of them will be together, which is pretty cool. And then my 4th child, my daughter Mary, who's completely different from them, she's interested in studying art. She has no interest in military career. She'd like to study art. She's talented with drawing and painting, and she'll be starting as a freshman studying art in college. And then, as I said, we've got 6 children home, 5 boys, and the youngest is a girl, Anna, who's 8. The 5 boys at this point are all interested in following their older brothers into military careers. So it's possible that I could have 7 sons and 1 daughter all in the military, which is pretty wild. But as I look at the relationships that I have with my kids, especially my adult kids, I think those relationships are pretty unique. They're not all perfectly happy and ideal, but there's a key, I think, to maintaining, or I shouldn't say maintaining, I should say developing lasting, intimate relationships with your children, especially your adult children. And I've been pushed into this as a parent with no guidance, of course. There's almost no one who talks about these practical subjects. But I'm an honest Catholic man. I take life seriously. I don't make excuses. And when there's a problem, I try to figure out what the cause of the problem is, and then I seek to eliminate the cause no matter what it costs, because either I need to eliminate the cause or I need to ignore it. And if I ignore it, then I need to accept the consequences of it, and I need to shut up and not whine about it, because I chose to leave the cause in place. As my kids first approached adulthood, our relationships were pretty crummy. We didn't get along very well. I was really displeased with choices they were making, and I felt that they were choosing to move away from our family. And that upset me, and I didn't think there was a reason for it. But there was one issue that was making me doubt myself. What it was in my kids, I saw a desire to remain connected. They desired to remain intimate. They desired to stay in touch. They desired to communicate. They didn't have a desire to just pack up and leave. They had no interest in leaving. But they were making decisions that I didn't like. And yet when I really thought about it, they didn't have bad spirits. And so I started to think more carefully about the situation and what exactly was going on. And what I realized was that when they turned 18 and all of these young adult opportunities open up, I was leaving them too much to themselves to figure out what to do in life, to make decisions, to earn what they need, to become independent, and so on. It was primarily financial. I was putting too much pressure on them to become independent, and the stress of that pressure was the cause of the bad decisions that they were making. Now, one of the reasons why I treated them the way I did, which I think was unfair, and I'm going to talk about this in a bit, one of the reasons was that when I deal with my own children, I often think back to my own life when I was their age. And when I was 19 years old, I was very mature. I was making important decisions, and I was making good decisions. I was moving away from my peers, away from kids my age, and I was spending time with my professors. I was spending time working and studying. I was spending time with my church leaders. I was spending time studying and pursuing religion. I was hanging out at the home of a 75-year-old professor. I was very mature for my age, and I wanted to get on with adult life. But there was a reason for that. And the reason for that was that God provided me with my wife when I was only 17 years old. I went into young adulthood with no thoughts about relationships or girls or dating or anything. I went into young adulthood with the biggest and most important issue in life already provided for. And I take that for granted. I take it for granted how free I was as a 19-year-old from any sort of social stress or pressure, because I already knew I was going to get married. I already knew whom I was going to marry. It was only a matter of time. And so, wanting to get married and looking forward to that, I just dug in and got to work as a 19-year-old, preparing to be a husband and father, head of a household, and so on. Personally and socially, I just skipped the whole college culture. And I went from a high school graduate to a college graduate without really any interaction with my peers. But all of that was possible because of the fact that I already had my wife in my pocket, as it were. And so that maturity that I had, that focus that I had, that comfort and security that I had as a 19-year-old and all through college, which was responsible for so much of my success during that phase of my life, my children don't have that. And my having that was pretty rare. It was an amazing kindness that God gave to me. And I realized that so many of the good things that I did as a young adult were owed to that providence. I didn't do the things that I did in the circumstances that my children are living. My circumstances were extraordinary, and I lived under the influence of those circumstances. And as I said, I give myself too much credit for the good things that I did and the good choices that I made. I give myself too much credit because I forget the circumstances and how easy those circumstances made my college years. So as I thought about that, I just started to realize that my kids approaching and entering adulthood didn't have any of that security that I had. And so I think this is common for most young adults. We ask them to do a bunch of things that are very difficult all at once. They go from being kids who live at home in the comfort of family life, and this continues until they're 16 or 17, and then we start loading pressures on them and expecting things that are really historically unprecedented and unrealistic. And we create, I really believe that parents in this generation are creating the circumstances that are destroying their families and their adult children's lives. Because we're putting too much pressure on them to do contradictory things all at the same time. And I think the real cause of this is the selfishness of parents. I'm 48 years old, as I said, and I'm working successfully, self-employed, doing well financially, and I have to be honest and say I'm looking forward to easier days when I can enjoy the fruits of my work with my wife. I'd like to travel a little. I'd like to take some more vacation time and relax with my wife because we've worked together nonstop since we were 18 years old. I look forward to some easier time. I look forward to spending days on the beach and so on. That's just my own personal desire, and it's selfish. And the danger is, as we get a little older, and we've been working for so long, and we're starting to get to the point where mortgages are getting paid off, bills are decreasing over time, income is increasing over time, we're tempted to shift into this retirement mode. And yet, our children are entering into the most difficult and stressful times of their lives, and it presents us with a very difficult decision. We're either going to go into retirement mode and tell our kids to fend for themselves, or we're going to deny ourselves that retirement mode and help our children. Everyone knows what the better decision is, but it's a very difficult decision. It's especially difficult if you have a career or work that you do only for money, and the only thing that motivates you is the prospect of being able to kick it into cruise control one day and live happily ever after. That's not the case in my life. I never intend to retire from classical studies or teaching. So maybe that's different. But I think that's one of the drawbacks of pursuing a career for money. It gets you into a bind morally when you've got to choose when to cast the golden parachute and cruise for the rest of your life, whether you can ever do that. But what I realized was I was putting too much pressure on my kids at a crucial time in their life, and that pressure was really leading them into bad decisions, leading them into bad practices. And I was the cause, not of the decisions, but of the pressure which influenced or was influencing the decisions. And I realized that I needed to fix that it wasn't right for me to expect my kids to make the same decisions I did, because their circumstances are not as good as my circumstances were, primarily because of God's providence of a wife for me when I was only 17 years old. We got married when we were 23, but we met at 17, and from the very beginning of our relationship, both of us knew we wanted to get married and we wanted to marry each other. So my 20s were very rare. And I had to be reminded of that as I thought about my kids' experience, because for them, raised in the Catholic Church, God has not provided for them with respect to a spouse in the same way that He's provided for me. That's created all kinds of pressure. And when those pressures are increased by financial pressures and career pressures and social pressures from our society, and so it just leads to bad decisions. It reminded me of Jesus' parable where He talks about the seed that's sown in different kinds of soils, and He explicitly warns about the seed that's sown among thorns. And He explains that the thorns represent the cares of this life, temporal pressures and anxieties. And He says the seed is sown and it sprouts and starts to grow. And this is what I saw in my children's lives. They were growing as Christians. They were happy as Christians. But then all of a sudden, the cares of this life started to choke out the seed, as the parable says. And their growth in the faith, their growth in virtue began to decline. As soon as they started to gain some independence, they started to shrink back from Catholic life. They started to turn away from Catholic principles, and they began to follow worldly influences. But what was important to realize was they were doing so under the influence of these choking cares of the world. And those choking cares of the world were something that I could relieve them from, just as a gardener would go out and weed the garden so that the plants can grow. As a father, I wasn't doing the work of the gardener. I was allowing these cares of the world to choke out my children. And I didn't understand that until we really got into their early adult years and I started to see what was happening. So what I started to do with my oldest son, he was getting into all of the usual kind of young adult trouble, making friends at school, making friends in his military activities and things like that. He'd start hanging out with those friends, hanging out on campus. And he was very stressed because he had a car payment to come up with every month, car insurance, expenses for his phone, all these different things. Thankfully, his schooling was paid for because of his military benefits. So his tuition and his housing and things like that could be paid for. He had to borrow a little bit of money each semester, but even that's going to be reimbursed when he graduates by the military. But just the monthly expenses of his independent life were a heavy burden to bear. And I realized that many of the undesirable things I saw in his life were being caused by this desire to escape from this stress at times. And this is something that I realized was in my control. So, what I decided to do was I told him, listen, from now on, I'll pay your car payment, I'll pay your insurance, any cash you need during the semesters, any financial help you need, just let me know. And Mom and I will help you financially. We don't want you to work during college. We don't want you to have these bills to worry about. I want you to focus all of your attention on your studies. Focus all your attention on the work that you have to do to prepare for your career. As soon as, and I should say this too, the financial stress of his life, and I'm talking about my oldest son, the financial stress was also affecting our relationship, because when the children feel that they're independent and they're responsible to bear all their own burdens, they start to despise the relationship they have with their parents because their parents aren't really important anymore. As soon as I made this offer to my son and told him that we would just help with all of his expenses, and we just wanted him to be a full-time student, focus on his studies, fulfill his military obligations, and not worry about anything outside of that. As soon as we did that, his whole life changed. He became a straight-A student. He was able to concentrate on his physical fitness and health, which is important in his military preparation and training. He was able to focus on his fitness, able to focus on different activities that were good for him socially. He was freed from the stress of having to work while he was in school. And he was able to just enjoy this phase of his life. And everything he's done since that change has been responsible and good. And right now, at 23, finishing up his studies, he's thriving. And I can point back and say, one thing changed all this, and it was relieving him of financial stress. Now, when I made this offer to him, he didn't suddenly become irresponsible and careless and foolish and start fooling around. He actually did the opposite. He became more responsible. He became more focused on his priorities in life. And most importantly, our relationship became very, very close, because he was sincerely thankful, and I think moved by our generosity and willingness to help. And I think before that, he might have wondered if we really love him, or if we just wish that he would grow up and go away and become independent. Because when you think about the message that we parents send to our kids about becoming independent, working for what you need, it's really an unloving message. When you think about parents who are trying to retire and they just want their kids to grow up and move on so they can be free to go and play, if you think about what that message feels like and sounds like to the kids, it's a pretty nasty message. You think about a kid being told by his parents, look, when you're 18, you've got to become independent. You've got to do this, you've got to find a place, you've got to pay your own bills, you've got to learn to blah, blah, blah. That's a pretty cold message for a kid to receive from his parents. And I think it's the wrong message. I think it's the wrong message. And I think we're pushing our kids out of the house, out of our life, out of our hair, selfishly, so we can have it easier at the wealthiest time of our life, rather than realizing that that time of our life, not while our children are young, because it's easy to keep kids happy when they're young, but that time of their life, when our kids feel how hard it is to become independent, when they feel how hard it is to become self-reliant, when they feel how expensive everything is, when they feel the difficulty, to feel the generosity of their parents at that time in their life is powerful. And they're not going to get that help from anybody else. There's nobody else who's going to be willing to pay for their bills and help them financially. Nobody else is willing to do that. And it's the point in their life where they're allowed to see that their parents love them in a way that no one else in the world can or does. And I think that we've allowed our families to break up by falling for this idea that if you want to be a good mommy or if you want to be a good dad, what you need to do is play with your toddlers. What you need to do is go to their baseball game or dance recital when they're 9 years old. We've accepted this message because it's easy. Those things are easy to do. My daughter's ballet classes, I think they may cost $100 a month. And I have to go to a recital every spring, and then they have a big performance at Christmas time every year. It cost me $100 a month and a couple hours a year. That's easy. I can take my kids to the zoo. I can take my kids to the beach. These things are easy. And They're pleasing for me too. I enjoy the week at the beach. I enjoy the day at the zoo. These things are easy. And much of our work as parents consists of the easy things like these. And all this talk about being with your kids when they're little is easy stuff. But that's not where the trouble comes. The trouble comes when they reach 18, 19, and they've got to start moving on. And the message from their parents is basically, screw you. Time for you to go, leave me alone, move out, take care of yourself, earn your own keep, because mom and I are going to start relaxing. And we push our kids out into the world, and everyone stands around wondering, why do these kids fall for things like socialism when they get to college? Because socialism is telling them exactly what they need to hear. They're feeling the difficulty of living independently. They're basically living as homeless people in college. They're watching as people like their parents live in luxury, and they live under the influence of all of this temporal, material pressure. And they say, this really sucks. And along comes the socialist college professor who says, this capitalist society is really cruel. People who have money keep it all for themselves, and everybody else is left to dig through the garbage for what they need. And these 19, 20, 21-year-old kids are saying, that's exactly what happened in my life. This is exactly what I'm experiencing. My parents are these capitalist people. It doesn't trickle down. It pours into their bank, and they lock it all up for themselves, while we go and work at Starbucks so we can make enough money to buy some ramen noodles for our dorm. These college kids see in their own experience the evil that's possible in a capitalistic society in their own relationship with their parents. And they need no convincing, because they know that this is true, because they see it every day. They see it every day. And so this conversion, as it were, this conversion to socialism, I argue, is being caused in the college environment by this retirement culture among parents. Our behavior as parents proves everything that the socialist college professor says to be absolutely true, not someplace far away among the billionaires, but in our kids' own family life. And that's our fault. We do that. The minute that we turn away from that ordinary way of family life, and we say to our children, look, the Lord's blessed us with everything we need. And at this point in your life, you're going to enter into the most difficult days, and we have an abundance. So we're going to allow God's provision to us to trickle down to you. And we're going to help you through these difficult years until you're finally standing firm on your own 2 feet, financially independent, in a good place. And we're going to give you these scissors and say, when you feel you're independent, go ahead and cut the cord. And until then, we're here to help. We're going to invest not in some stocks for our retirement benefits. We're not going to invest in our retirement account. We're going to invest in you and help you establish a happy life as God has provided for us to enjoy a happy life. Imagine the socialist college professor telling that kid how capitalism works, how the benefits never trickle down, how the poor just become poorer and the rich become richer. That kid would raise his hand and say, this isn't true at all. And I have a clear example. My own parents prove that this is not true. I think the homosexual stuff comes from the same source. Just think about what happens. We do a very bad job as parents of helping our children find potential partners. We do a very poor job at this in American society. I would say in Catholic society as well. One of the reasons I think parents push their kids towards religious vocations so much is they don't want to deal with the responsibility of helping their children marry well. We pretend that urging our kids onto religious life is responsible Catholic parenting, and if they choose to not pursue religious life, we look at them as if we're disappointed, almost as if they've chosen to reject the faith itself. And the truth is, I know this is true of me, I really don't want to be bothered with trying to help my kids find worthy partners for marriage. And the reason why I'm not interested in this is because I never had to do it. I never had to seek a partner for marriage. And so in my brain, I wouldn't even know where to begin because I never had to do it. I never went to my high school prom because my girlfriend didn't care about that stuff. I didn't have to impress a girl. I never participated in that kind of school social activity because I was already at the finish line in my mind. And my wife felt the same way. We would rather spend the time hanging out. We'd rather work and study so we can get closer to being in a position where we could get married. We had no interest in prolonging our youth when we were together. And so when I look at my kids and I see that for them, finding a partner, finding a faithful Catholic partner is like finding a unicorn. It's very difficult. And I'll admit that I've been very selfish in not wanting to participate in that. I've made a number of decisions in my kids' lives that I see negatively affected their ability and opportunity to meet worthy candidates, I could say, for marriage. And I think that many Catholic parents do the same thing. Now, what's interesting is when we look back to the lives of the saints, we often find that it was the opposite. When we look to the lives of the saints, we often find that the parents were pressuring the kids to marry and supplying the partners. We find that the parents were the ones making the connections for the kids and saying, here, look, Elizabeth, we want you to marry Thomas here. He's from a good family. He's a good Catholic man. He's got a good future ahead of him. He's responsible. He'd be a good husband for you. We want you to marry Thomas. And they would urge the daughter to marry their chosen partner. And this is not forced marriage. This is just normal matchmaking by parents who are looking out for the interests and welfare of their kids. And the same was true for men. Think of the story, even though it's fake. So remember, this is fiction. Think of It's a Wonderful Life, where George's mother is constantly pushing him to go talk to Mary. The mother has already picked the girl that she wants the son to marry, the best girl in town, and the mother is trying to make this connection, urging her son to pursue this particular girl. You can see the influence of parents and the concern they have to take it upon themselves to do this matchmaking. And many of us don't want to do that. And so we either pretend that our kids should just all become religious so we don't have to bother with this nonsense, or we leave them as 18-year-olds to go and figure it out themselves. Oh, and they need to figure it out while they're in college, while they're working, while they're becoming financially independent. They also need, in the presence of all of that stress, they also need to find a partner. And what I think is that this culture of leaving kids under all of this stress to find their own partners with no support in this from the church, who's partly to blame, from the Catholic community, who's partly to blame, from the parents all around these kids, not just their own parents, but a whole community of parents, and from their own parents. It creates an intense source of pressure and stress on the kids that they really don't want to have to handle. And I think this is one of the reasons why homosexuality, whether real or not, because this is an important distinction I think we need to make, homosexuality becomes a way out of that pressure. To just say, I'm not interested. I'm not interested. I'm not interested in the opposite sex. I'm not interested in marriage. I'm not interested in this. It becomes a way to avoid the question. And the pressure on the kids is so great that when you think about the pressure of having to identify as a gay person, that pressure is not as bad as the pressure of having to try to find a spouse in the midst of all of these other pressures of paying your bills, of going to college, of choosing a career, of choosing a major. The pressure on the kids is just too great. They're being asked to do all of these colossal things at one time. And rather than being helped in them, they're just being judged by the adults around them as they fail to succeed in all of them. I was one of these kids as far as finances go because my parents did not contribute a single dollar to my college years. The attitude was, well, you know what? We're not rich enough to pay your tuition, so you're going to have to use financial aid or earn scholarships. But that was just an excuse to not help at all. They didn't help with gas for my car. They didn't help with some pocket money to get something to eat. They didn't help with clothes. They didn't help with books. It was just an excuse. Oh, we can't afford to pay for you to go to school. You're going to have to rely on financial aid. But that extended all the way down to money for some food. It was just an excuse to not help at all. So I bore the financial pressure. I know what that's like. There were semesters where I couldn't go to school because I couldn't pay tuition, and I didn't want to borrow $10,000 because I really didn't know what my future was going to be. Other people helped me. One semester, a lady at our church who was a nurse paid my tuition. Other people did for me nice things, and I would think, that lady who paid my tuition, that was very nice of her. Why wouldn't my parents think to do that? Why would a stranger think to do that, but not my parents? And why would I not think to do that? Now, fortunately for my kids, they don't need any help with tuition or room and board, but they do need help with month-to-month expenses, which are hundreds and hundreds of dollars. But still, we put all of this pressure on them during these years and expect them to study. When you just stop and think about it, doesn't it get ridiculous? They're supposed to, we complain, these kids, they grow up and go to college and they lose the faith. Yeah, Jesus explained exactly what causes the loss of faith. He said it's because they're choked out by the cares of the world. What are we even asking the kids to do? What we're asking them to do is laughably ridiculous if you stop and think about it. We're asking these kids to become independent in a competitive capitalistic society. We're asking them to maintain the Catholic faith in a wildly secular and immoral society. We're asking them to go to college and do well in school, which costs tens of thousands of dollars. We ask them to make decisions about future careers, choose majors, succeed in college, think about graduate school, maybe professional school, figure out how they're going to get started with a career. Oh, and by the way, find a spouse who shares your common faith and is a good influence for you. Make sure you find one of them too while you're doing all these other things. These kids have a list of impossible tasks. Not impossible individually, but impossible when taken all together. It's impossible to do all these things between the ages of 18 and 22. It's impossible. And I will argue that this worldly stress piled upon these kids causes them to stop going to church. It causes them to seek other ways to have relationships rather than marriage. It leads them to struggle, if not fail, in their studies. It leads them to accept alternative philosophies of life, alternative political philosophies, anti-Catholic political and economic philosophies. And it leaves them in the state that we find these modern Catholic young adults. And we point the finger at these kids and we say, kids these days. But the cause of this, I will argue, is not the kids. It's the parents. The parents are the cause of the kids these days. Because the kids are selfishly left to themselves to bear the greatest burdens in life as if they have no parents. They're essentially sent into the world as 18-year-old orphans. And they live like orphans in the world with none of the benefits of parents, while the parents delude themselves into thinking that this is somehow good for the children, that they're left to themselves. If all the fruits in the children's lives are bad, then this can't be good for their lives. And I think we're causing this. As I mentioned before, when I mentioned homosexuality, I think there are many kids under these pressures of young adult life, under the peer pressure around them, under the social pressure around them, who are willing to identify as gay, let's say among their friends on campus, because it's simply convenient. I don't believe they're as sexually active as Christians tend to imagine they are. We imagine that anyone who identifies as gay is just immersed in sodomy. We imagine the worst. We assume and suspect the worst with no evidence for such. I actually heard an interview once where a homosexual older man, an older homosexual man who was, gay in the 70s and 80s. This older homosexual man was complaining. He was complaining that homosexual younger people aren't having sex. That was his complaint. He was complaining that the younger homosexuals, the younger generation of homosexuals, aren't having sex. And I believe that, because I believe that a lot of this identifying as homosexual doesn't mean the same thing in 2020 or 2023 now as it did in 1980. I don't believe it means the same thing. I believe for many kids, it's an escape from the pressure of finding a marriage partner. And when we think about the college campus situation, that these kids are just all shoved onto campus with nothing to keep them busy, they're left in idleness under all kinds of stress. How does sexual immorality not normally arise from those circumstances? And I don't think it's fair to say, oh, these kids, they're seeking all this out. They're just pursuing all of this. I don't believe that's true. First of all, I think it's exaggerated. And second, I don't think it's a way of life that these kids freely choose. I think we are causing these little ones to stumble, as Jesus said. And sending them to a Catholic college rather than that hardly has any difference on anything. Because all of the same pressures and cares are present. They may even be greater in a Catholic environment. But I think the core evil is we're asking kids to become all of these things as orphans between the ages of 18 and 22. And the results that we see in their lives are the effects of a cause that we're responsible for. This is our fault. We claim that we love our kids. We claim they're the most valuable thing in our lives. We claim there's nothing we would have more. And we act to the complete contrary of that by how we actually deal with them. We say one thing and we clearly do the opposite. And we've got ourselves deceived. And so what parents do is they go to an extreme and they say, oh, well, we're not sending our kids to college because, no, you're missing the whole point. And what's going to happen with these kids who are kept home from college or who don't go to college is they're just going to have to deal with the same exact problems, only not in college. And I think that could be even worse because, as I tell my kids all the time, college is actually one of the best times of life. My college years were some of the happiest years of my life. And if the circumstances are right, college is great. It's one of the only times in life where you can spend a lot of time with friends, spend a lot of time studying and talking and arguing with people, while also doing something that's contributing to your future career. It's really a great opportunity, and financial aid helps kids to enjoy it. Scholarship opportunities help kids to enjoy it. Even if you have to tap into student loans, the rates and things are low, and it can be a good use of available funds. But there are many ways to handle the finances of college, and I think that people complain about the cost too much, because many of the costs are just the result of stupidly managing the costs of college. And a lot of times kids make use of student loans because they're dropped off on campus with no money, and the loan is the only way they have to even get what they need. It's just not a realistic commitment from the parents. And you say, well, we're parents, we can't afford. Well, maybe parents need to work harder, because the costs of raising happy kids and happy families is a lot higher than we've budgeted for. So anyway, getting back to the solution, I think parents need to take much more seriously the responsibility not to provide for kids until they move out, or not until they go to college, or not until they turn 18. But parents, Christian parents, have to take responsibility to provide for their children until their children are independent, are actually independent. Parents should provide for their children until they are actually, happily independent. And the goal of that provision, in light of the parable of the sower, the goal of that provision is to prevent the seed from being choked out by the weeds. And Jesus said, the weeds are the cares of this life. I don't think it can get any clearer what the problem is and what the solution is. And this is something that the grace of God should enable parents to do, should enable Christian parents to do, because Christians should have the virtue to be this kind of parent. We're challenged by the evangelical counsels to live in voluntary simplicity, voluntary poverty. That's not true only for monks. That's true for all Christians. That's the way of perfection. And you can see that if parents would embrace that counsel of poverty, voluntary poverty, while also working responsibly and being industrious and prudent, those parents would have the resources that they are free to share generously with their children during this most influential time of their life, as they enter into these young adult years. As I said, the minute that I made this change with my son Jonathan, his whole life changed. Our relationship was transformed in a minute. As soon as that change happened, all of the things that I was upset about stopped. And he's done nothing but good since I made that change. My eldest daughter's in a little bit of a more difficult situation, because she's one of these kids who went away from home at 18, which I consider to have been my fault, because I didn't understand this at the time. she went off and came under the influence of other people with all of these pressures of life, with not much support and help from her family, feeling that she now needed to become independent. And she was embraced by another girl in the military who became very intimate friends with my daughter. And I just want to say, this is a girl who comes to our house, who my wife and I like very much. She's a medic in the military, very nice girl. There's nothing bad that I could say about her. But her and my daughter developed a relationship where they came together with these similar circumstances. They came together and they took comfort in this friendship. I call it a friendship. A friendship that to them seems like much more than a friendship, but to me is really just a great friendship. And because of the pressure of getting married and all these kinds of things, they've chosen to, and again, under the influence of what our society is telling people and even the confusion that comes from the church, what the church's message is. The church's message causes confusion in the minds of kids in these circumstances. And when you mix all of these problems together in a pot, it leads you to a situation where you have a 21-year-old daughter who thinks that she's gay. And you can see how all of these ingredients come together to lead to this pot of soup. And in my daughter's life, my daughter will be the first one to talk out against transgenderism, to talk out against any kind of gay rights parade or anything like that. She has no interest in any of that culture. She's a straight A college student, successful in everything she does, beautiful girl, and we have a great relationship. And it's my experience with my kids that's caused me to pump the brakes on a lot of these knee-jerk, ignorant reactions from Christian people, because it's much more complicated. It's much more complicated, and when I reflect on the things, I can see myself being much more culpable for different parts of these developments. I have no idea how these things will end. Thankfully, I know that mistakes I did make, I made in ignorance. And when I was able to discover the cause of them, I know that I have amended my life and fixed them. So I have no guilty conscience or anything like that. And now I am fixing them. And like I said, even with my daughter, as soon as that disposition changed in myself, and I realized that I need to support my children until they are happily independent. Not until they move out, but until they're happily independent, the relationships improve. Even though they were good before, they're almost perfect now. And then my next son, David, he's sort of come into college with us already in this mentality, and he's also doing very well. So I think the early trouble that my family got into as our first children entered into adulthood, considering what other people are experiencing, we started to experience all the same stuff that everybody's complaining about. But I think I identified the cause of it. And it's a cause that we better fix, because I think we're responsible for this. I think selfish parents are responsible for many of these problems in the lives of these young people. And these are Catholic kids. I know my kids were all raised in the church. They were all confirmed in the church, and to be confirmed, you have to go through confirmation voluntarily. My kids were confirmed in the church. My kids attended Mass every Sunday their whole life, every day of obligation their whole life. All kinds of Catholic formation, training, altar service. They were Sunday school teachers as teenagers. And yet I started to see these social things developing in their lives. And I said, what the heck is going on? How can my kids, who have had a completely different upbringing, completely different life and experience and education, how can they possibly be bearing these common fruits of this modern society? And it's because what they have in common is not their education, not their family life when they're 12 years old, not their church life when they're 15 years old. What they have in common is the stress of this life as young adults to bear by themselves, and having that in common with everybody else nullifies all the benefits of their childhood and leads them into the same problems that we see among young adults today. And I think it's our fault. We take responsibility for their infancy. We take responsibility for their toddler years. We take responsibility for their elementary school years. We take responsibility, though it starts to decline, for their teenage years. We already start making excuses. We start talking to them about having to become independent. This cold relationship starts to develop, and then when they turn 18, we go full throttle with this. We're no longer responsible attitude, and all of the evils rush in. And I believe it's because of the stresses and the cares of life that come upon the kids in the college years, and the message of our society that reaches those kids under those pressures produces the fruits that we see: the anger, the lack of love, the disrespect for parents, the interest in all of these alternative socio-political theories and political movements and sexual identities and all this kind of stuff. I think they can all be traced back to one problem, and it's the selfishness of their parents. The fact that we let these kids move out or push them out at an age where they're nowhere near prepared for the pressures that they're going to face, and we expect of them success in everything with no assistance from us. They find more assistance, more love, more comfort, more protection, more support from these anti-Christian people than they do from their own Christian parents. We create that problem. And the good news is, as much as it should grieve us, and I think we had better be penitent and contrite over this, the good news is that it's not difficult to fix. We can fix it. And I know in my life, as soon as I figured out what the problem was and put things together, as soon as I made the change, I saw the fruits change. And hopefully, if you've already got kids at this point, you can put this theory of mine to the test. And if you've got younger children and you haven't yet had to deal with these young adult years, I'm warning you that the time you spend with them when they're young and the efforts you make to live a happy family life when they're young, if that same love and support doesn't continue into their young adult years, everything you're doing today is going to be wasted. You've got to prepare financially to support your children and help them. You've got to prepare emotionally to support them and help them. You've got to prepare spiritually, because ultimately it's a test of charity. You've got to prepare spiritually for the challenges of supporting your adult children until they are happily independent. I hope that helps. God bless.